and you formerly knew me as the Deputy Director of the ACLU of Washington, but there have been changes in my life, and where I am now is, as of March 1st, I am your Executive Director of the ACLU. And so excited to be in this role. We have been in this fight for our civil rights and our civil liberties and for democracy for nearly 100 years. And that fight has intensified, as you are well aware, in more recent years. It means so much to me personally to be able to lead this amazing, amazing staff in this important work. And as someone whose ancestors were not entitled to the benefits of the Constitution, it is all that much more important to me to fight particularly for the rights of those who are not able to exercise their civil rights and their civil liberties. This is the work that we have in front of us. Your support means so much to us, and I'm really grateful to see you all again this year and to stand before you in this new role. So thank you so much for being here. So, as usual, I have a couple of things to say before we get started. A couple of serious things and then a couple of housekeeping things. And so first of all, I do want to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish people. And this is an acknowledgement that even as we fight for civil rights and civil liberties for all people, we have not accorded Indigenous people their rights as they should have been. Much was stolen from them, and we still have much work to do to honor those people, those who are the water keepers and the keepers of this land, the stewards of this land. And as this year proceeds, we'll be able to maybe share more with you some of the work we're specifically doing with Indigenous folks. The other thing I want to talk about before we really get started is I think the last time we were here together was in November, and a lot of things have happened since then. And in particular, I want to call out that there have recently been multiple incidents of hatred, right? There was the terrible shooting in the mosques in New Zealand, and then actually just recently in Southern California, an arson at a mosque down there north of San Diego. And of course, last fall, there was the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And in all of these cases, right, the people have directly called out the ways in which our current national leader inspired them, and this resurgence of white nationalism. And I just really want to lift that up because the times are serious. Many people, their lives are in danger in ways that are intensified. I won't say that their lives weren't ever in danger before. And so just really appreciating you acknowledging with us how serious this work is right now. And also, on a serious note, right? So, yeah, the Mueller report came out. So we're not feeling the excitement about that. But here's the thing that I want to tell you. It's the presidential's appointee of the Attorney General who is telling us what that report means and interpreting what that means in terms of, again, our nation's leader. And I want to tell you, we need some daylight on that report. We don't know what it says. All of it. Right. So what I want you to know, if you are not already receiving our action alerts, right, our executive director of the National ACLU, Anthony Romero, has put a call out for folks to sign a petition that report get released. And so if you haven't had a chance to do that, you can go to the National ACLU website, aclu.org, and just scroll down on that homepage, and you will be able to also sign on to say that we want to see that report. We need that report to be out and to understand the nuances of it. So please join in with us on that, because that's really important. So, and I will just say, today we're talking about voting rights, and if some of these things that I've already described to you don't make you feel like you need to be engaged, I don't know what would. So we're going to get into the voting rights shortly, but I want to share a couple quick victories with you that we've had in our own Washington State affiliate since we were last here with you, and then as promised, those housekeeping items, right? So just two things I want to share, and one of them I just feel so proud about because we were able to call into question, right, the validity of lifetime employment bans. So if you've been following our news, we had that Crystal Fields case versus the Department of Early Learning, and Crystal Fields had a 28-year-old conviction for an attempted robbery, which was preventing her from being able to work in her chosen field. And there was just a blanket ban. Like if you had certain kinds of convictions, then you were just out to lunch. And the Washington State Supreme Court recognized the problem with that and gave her the opportunity to plead her own case and other people like her. So we're very proud of our legal team for helping us to get that across the finish line. And that is that work truly that is about second chances. We also had a great victory in terms of holding law enforcement accountable for deadly force. So we had talked about this before. The ACLU Washington was really proud to join with community organizations, particularly organizations led by individuals who had lost family members to police violence, in getting I-940 across the ballot in November. And so that was a great success, with actually amazing turnout for that vote all over the state, not just in the more progressive King County. Even in Yakima County, apparently there was a really large vote in favor of getting 940 passed. And then just now in the legislative session, the legislature, within the first couple of weeks of session, actually passed some additional amendments to just strengthen that. So what that means is our standard has changed. That whole thing of having to prove malice is gone. Thank goodness. Clap for that. And we instead have this objective, reasonable officer standard, along with all this training that's required and oversight, independent investigations, and so on. So this is a real triumph. So wanted to just share a couple quick victories with you. And then, as always, we have social media for our program. We're live streaming on Facebook. You can post whatever you want to say, preferably good. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you are, with the hashtag ACLU Flights. Want to give a special shout out to those of you who said we like beer, but some of us like not beer. And want to thank Guayaki, I think I said that right, I hope so, for offering us the delicious yerba mate, the strength of coffee, the health benefits of tea, and the euphoria of chocolate, all in one beverage. In my script. So thank you, Guayaki. And also we're pouring beer from Fremont Brewing, so that's delicious. Yes. And that would be the beer lovers, the tea lovers. Okay. And then, as always, please join with me in thanking our wonderful, wonderful hosts who we've been doing this with for 2 years, since 2016 when we got started, KEXP. These folks are awesome, and we love being in this space. And then also, if you didn't do a raffle ticket, please do a raffle ticket, because we will have prizes from the ACLU and from I can't get that word out again, from the people providing the delightful tea with the euphoria of chocolate and the strength of coffee, etc. Okay, so now, finally, if you are a member of the ACLU, who's a member? Woo! Okay, yeah, nice, that's more than half. We want, one day for me to say that and all the hands to wave in one joyous, because when you become a member for a ridiculously low price, it enables us to be able to say, this is the amount of membership we have when we're down at the legislature, when we're arguing in front of the Supreme Court. These are the people who believe in our Constitution and that these rights should apply to every person who's here. Everyone belongs. Everyone has the right, regardless of your gender identity, sexual orientation, color of your skin, where you were born, okay? That's what we're fighting for, and when you join with us, that's what you're fighting for. So thank you, members, and thank you, would-be members. Since the current presidential administration, the ACLU has taken on more than 177 different legal actions against the Trump administration since Inauguration Day, many of them related to immigration rights and the Muslim travel ban and government accountability and transparency and women's rights and reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights and voting rights, which we'll soon be talking about, free speech and using religion to discriminate, which we don't like. So, we work at the courts, the legislature, the ballot box, and you are helping us to do all this work. So we're fighting for every person in this country. Defending the right to vote, which is our topic tonight, is a huge challenge across the United States, and the ACLU is working with community partners, some of whom you will very soon meet, to help us secure and protect this very precious right. This right that is, in fact, fundamental to what it means to be a democracy, because a democracy is about participation. This year, we're actually celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the passage of the Voting Rights Restoration Act here in Washington, which restored the right to vote for people leaving the criminal justice system once they were out of the control of the Department of Corrections. And I would also point out that a bill got introduced this year, and it died already, but that's okay, because it'll be back next year to even enhance that further by allowing people to vote immediately upon leaving prison. So right now you have to actually be out of the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections. So if you're on work release or have certain other things happening, you're not eligible yet. And so under this bill, that would be immediate, which would be amazing. But we're still happy that folks who are coming out of incarceration have the right to vote here. And so that was a huge milestone in voting rights, but there have been lots of other amazing things that have happened that we've worked on with our allies. And so tonight we have representatives from Washington Bus, Washington Can, and OneAmerica to discuss how far we've come and what the work is that's left. So if all of you folks would come on up and have a seat, but not sit at the end where I'm sitting, I will introduce you. So please clap while they come up and I'll tell you who they are. So we have Bridget Williams, wave. Is that you? Okay, yay, welcome Bridget. The Community Engagement Coordinator of Washington Bus, first getting involved in voter registration and voting justice and engaging young people while a student at Western Washington University. I know, go, what's your mascot? Go Vikings, okay. And she continued those efforts as a Washington Bus Fellow in the summer of 2016, but is now in the community engagement role and working to transfer political power to high school and college students, which is awesome. And then from Washington Can, we have Xochitl Maykovich. Is that correct? Okay, very good. And Xochitl's been with Washington Can for more than 4 years, daughter of a Mexican immigrant. She grew up in rural North Carolina in a military town. And this background helped Xochitl learn about building political power in communities. She worked to organize and improve Swedish Hospital's charity care program, led the fight to pass Seattle's move-in fee legislation, and is now leading grassroots effort to repeal the state ban on rent regulation and pass eviction reform. Xochitl sits on the board of Puget Sound Advocates for Retirement Action, although I'm guessing Xochitl's pretty pre-retirement, and NARAL Pro-Choice Washington, and is co-chair of the Seattle Women's Commission. So representing OneAmerica is Eli Goss, right? Okay. Senior Policy Manager at OneAmerica, largest immigrant rights and advocacy organization in Washington. I used to be on the board, love that organization. Before OneAmerica, Eli was executive director of the Washington Student Association, where they supported student organizing for voter access, student debt, and campus sexual assault, and later the political director with NARAL Pro-Choice Washington. Did you guys know each other before? Excellent. And they're also on the organizing collective of the Coalition of Anti-Racist Whites, and a proud graduate of Evergreen State College. Yeah, right? Apparently there's some, and huh?
Go Gooey Duck.
We've got a Viking, we've got a Gooey Duck. Your UNC Chapel, what was your? Tar Heels. Oh yeah, I should have known that. Okay, so great. And one last thing about Eli, because Eli moved here from Texas and still is looking for good barbecue. Okay, so later on, if you have suggestions for Eli, please let them know. And then finally, and then I'm going to get out of the way in a minute and not be blocking the people, we have Breanne Schuster right here from the ACLU of Washington. Breanne joined our staff in 2015, attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Badgers, okay. And spent a year working and learning French in Brussels, graduated from Seattle University School of Law, was executive editor for the Seattle Journal for Social Justice, volunteered with Homeless Rights Advocacy Project, interned with ACLU Washington and Alliance for a Just Society, Disability Rights Washington, and public defender organizations. And enjoys dancing, painting, cooking, singing, hiking, biking, long runs, and reading, not looking for barbecue. So, on that note, I'm going to hand this microphone over to Breanne, and then I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to ask these folks some questions. They're going to take this podium out of the way. Give us just about a second. Don't go anywhere. Don't start talking. Don't do anything. And we'll be right back with you. Oh, yes, clap for them, please. They did that very quickly and efficiently. So I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. So, voting, we've talked about it a little bit already. It's very important. It is fundamental to democratic process. And I think that it matters, and not just for presidential elections, although people are thinking about that an awful lot right now, right? But it matters every time there's an election or a ballot, right? There's something, whether it's about a school levy or some initiative that you should either vote for or against, right? It matters all the time. And so these folks are gonna say a lot more with us about why it matters and give us a chance to talk about the national and the local issues that might be of interest to you. So I already introduced them, so I'm gonna actually start with Breanne and ask you to maybe give us some history and context, why the ACLU is working on voting issues and some of the key concerns nationally and here in Washington State. And also just how that intersects with racial justice, because that's really important for us to think about.
Absolutely. So thank you, Michelle. I think a lot of Michelle's opening comments really touched on why both I care personally about voting rights as well as why the ACLU cares about voting rights. And I'm going to say it again, but voting really is the cornerstone of our democracy, right? It's how we ensure that people are represented in their government, that they have a say in who runs the government, that they have a say in who drafts our laws, who enforces our laws, where resources go and where they don't go, who gets to decide that, who appoints judges and other officials, the list goes on. And so it's just so fundamental at both the local and the national level. And it's obvious, I think, in many ways, right, when we see our current administration and how they're infringing on so many civil liberties, but it's so much more entrenched than that, right? It's our whole immigration system, it's our poverty system, it's healthcare access, it's it's really the bedrock of what all of our civil liberties rest upon. And so that's why I care about voting, and I think why the ACLU cares about voting. And I think one of the many reasons why these systems have been able to not just exist, but continue to exist and be perpetuated, right, is because we have so many entrenched barriers to accessing the ballot and to making voting equitable amongst all communities, right? Having everyone have an equal say in who runs our government and who's in power. So when I think in Washington, sometimes it can be really easy because we think of ourselves as like the super progressive and like blue state. And there's a lot of work to be done, right? Both here in Washington and elsewhere. But I also think about all of the ways that people try to restrict the right to vote, right? And if it didn't matter, why would there be so many efforts to try to make it so hard for me to vote, and so hard for people of color to vote, and so hard for people with disabilities to vote, and youth to vote, and the list goes on. And so I think the power in the right to vote is so obvious from how hard people try to make it difficult for people. So as far as what those barriers look like and the key concerns nationally, it's not voter fraud. So I think we're going to go into a little bit more depth later in the panel about like what particular issues we see and what each of our ally organizations see. But I would just flag that I think for me, most of it all comes down to the question that you posed, Michelle, which is how does this intersect with racial justice? And I think racial justice is really is the issue, right? It's voting rights and racial justice are so intertwined, and the barriers that we've continued to see from outlawing voting explicitly for people of color to having a poll tax, to having literacy tests, to preventing people with a felony conviction from voting, election systems that are majority rule. All of these have their roots in racism, and I think that's kind of my primary concern, both what's happening nationally and what's happening locally.
Thank you, Breanne. Spot on. So Xochitl, there's a lot of barriers to voting, and I would love for you to talk about how you're seeing some of those barriers show up from your perspective working with Washington Can, and what some of the work is that you all are doing to eliminate barriers to voting.
So a little bit about Washington Can. We're a community grassroots organization, and we prioritize organizing people of color, immigrants, and people with low incomes. Like my goal is to find people who are not engaged in the political process and get them engaged. But there's a couple things that I think are a huge barrier, right? So there's some that are obvious. So one, I think the fact that people who are, not only people who have felony convictions, there's issues, it can be difficult to vote. It's also people who are currently incarcerated, right? Like, why is it that people who are incarcerated can't vote? When arguably they probably have the state is controlling the most of their life, right? Out of anyone else in our country. So that's a huge barrier. The other one, I think, citizenship is also a huge barrier. I mean, when I think about our members in Auburn, we were talking about who could run for office. And then we're thinking about who could do that. And there's a lot of limitations around that due to the citizenship requirement, right? So I mean, there's some really obvious things like that. But then there's also things around the lack of investment in educating folks about what's on the ballot, how all of the process works. There's so many people who don't understand, and it's not because they're not able to understand, obviously. It's because our school system and everything just doesn't really invest in educating the community about how the process works. And I can say, even though I do this, professionally through a job, like the legislature is very difficult to navigate from a community perspective, right? It's not a friendly place, I'll tell you. Maybe if I was like a rich white dude lobbying for the pharmaceutical industry, maybe it'd be a little different. But, and so I think all of those things, both locking people out of the process entirely due to things about who they are as individuals, but also the lack of education around voting makes it difficult for people to get engaged. And so some of the things that we're doing, so one, we do a whole lot of door knocking. I'm sure at some point in time you might have gotten door knocked by us. And we often target communities that are have the lowest propensity of voting to try and walk people through, this is what the process is like to vote, this is what's on your ballot. And the other thing is, I think, getting people to believe that they can create change, right? That just that fundamental belief that you can do something about the system is also a barrier. But, by building relationships with community members, we've been able to do that and getting people, we were also involved with De-Escalate. We've been involved with other initiatives and other efforts around different issues to really get people engaged and getting people to vote. And I think our membership voter turnout, I think last year was in the 80s, much higher than the state level. So we're really good at getting people to vote.
That's awesome. One of the things you mentioned, which is so true, is not only the lack of understanding of democratic process just generally, because we don't have civics in school anymore and all that sort of thing, but also then the ballot measures come up and people don't understand what they are, and so either they just don't vote on a bunch of stuff, or they vote but they vote without knowing what they're voting for. And so I know that the Washington Bus spends a lot of time trying to get people, especially young people, engaged in understanding the democratic process and understanding voting. But I think there is definitely a perception that young people are apathetic or they're not voting. And so I want to know, is that true? And then what are you doing about it, if it is?
Hello? Okay, cool. Like you said, the Washington Bus works to get young people more involved in the political process. And yes, voter turnout among young people is pretty low. The average voting age in Washington State is 62 years old during off-year elections. Yeah, which means that 62-year-olds are making the decisions about the lived experiences of young people without their input in that process, which is really, really scary.
Not that there's anything wrong with 62-year-old people.
Yes, but when we say in the field, when we're registering young people to vote, we're would you let a 62-year-old pick your outfit? Would you let a 62-year-old pick who you date? And often we use that to kind of be hey, look, maybe you should be having a voice in our education policy, for example. And who's representing you in King County, who's representing you in your city. And, in last year's election, only 56% of 18 to 24-year-olds were registered to vote, which speaks a lot to how inaccessible our voting system is, our voter registration system is. And then from that 56%, only 51% of those young people actually turned out and voted. And a lot of people say that it's because young people are apathetic, that they don't care about the political process, but really young people care a lot about what's going on in this city, about what's going on in this county, what's going on in Washington. We're upset about the homeless sweeps. We're upset about the new youth jail. We're upset about how inaccessible college is and how expensive it is and how we're all in debt. We're upset about gentrification. And the Washington Bus really tries to remind young people to get out there and actually vote. And we do text banks, we do phone banking, we do door knocking, much like Washington can. And because of that, we found that from the people that we register to vote and we remind to vote, that the chance of them voting is then the percentage of them voting is 72%, which is about on par with Washington turnout average. So that's like pretty awesome, and it shows that young people will vote if we remind them to vote and we engage them in the process. And I think often young people are ignored by our candidates and by campaigns because they're low propensity voters. And instead, campaigns really focus on high propensity voters, which are typically white, middle to upper class people who are 62 years old. And because of that, that leaves out huge chunks of our population who have a lot to say about what's going on, and the people running in their districts aren't talking to them, aren't visiting them, aren't knocking on their doors. And that's really sad because we have a lot to say. And I think that like the Washington Bus does a really good job to like engage with these people and talk to them about the different ways that voting can have an impact on their lives and an impact on their communities. We go to high schools, we go to college campuses, we work with student organizers across Washington State. We go to 2-year campuses, we go to 4-year campuses. We also go to community events like Capitol Hill Block Party. In the past, we've gone to Sasquatch, Bumbershoot, just events where a lot of young people show up. And we talk to them about voting, and we register them to vote. And then we remind them to vote. And we've seen that it makes a really huge difference in the amount that young people are showing up and turning in their ballots.
That's awesome. Eli, I know that OneAmerica is really focused on building power in immigrant communities, and so I know that those are some of the communities that have often encountered a lot of barriers to voting. So I'd love to hear from your perspective what some of those barriers are, and also what are some of the things OneAmerica has accomplished in removing those.
Yes, definitely. And so I just want to say I'm way too short for this chair. And so I kind of feel like I'm 6 again. And I'm just kind of, so I'm trying to stay grounded and remember that I'm an adult with a career and I can talk to computers. Okay. Way to go, 5 foot. Exactly. So my name is Eli. I'm with OneAmerica, and I guess too, just to start, I want to lift up our organization and our organizers. A lot of our core part of our work is done by our organizers across the state and our leaders in our base communities. So we do a lot of organizing in immigrant communities to build leadership development and build power in immigrant and refugee communities. And so you might be wondering, like, okay, so why is a white person talking to me about this? And so I just want to lift up our leaders, and there was a lot of folks that were supposed to be here tonight, and they had other engagements, and so they asked me to step in. And so I'm here to try and do justice to a lot of the work that they've done, and just want to really lift up and affirm that it's work that they've been doing for years. And so to kick off, So to kick off, I think some key barriers that we've heard from a lot of our leaders and our organizers from folks voting is number one, language access. You have to request a ballot in a different language, and how many of us in the room often leave our ballot till like day before? It's okay, you can be honest. Oh, okay, no, this is like the hyper engaged group. Okay. Typically when I ask that, okay, well, yeah. So either a couple days before or day of, it's on your counter, you're waiting for it, and then you start seeing everyone on social media posting about how they're voting. You're like, oh yeah, I should do that. But when you think about having to request a ballot in a language and how long that can take from county auditors across the state, also making sure you're comfortable with confidence in what's on the ballot. I mean, for many of us, it's confusing to read, the lovely, put that in quotation marks, Tim Eyman initiatives, do you approved to or maintain the tax man? And you're like, what the heck is this? So, and then also issues, a lot of times initiative language is very confusing, the pro-con statements, etc. And so think about it. If you're already trying to either request a ballot in another language, or you're trying to read through it yourself, and you're trying to understand, one, how our government system works, how Washington State works, what's the difference between a ballot initiative versus an initiative to the legislature, and different, is this a county measure, is this a state measure, is this a city tax, is it a state tax, is it a maintain, is it a repeal? These are often really confusing concepts for any average person, much less someone that's learning also a whole other government system. And I remember sitting down too with one of our leaders in South King County, and we were talking about how important it is to fill out a ballot. We're doing a ballot party and filling it out, and she's like, oh, you want to talk about government? Let's talk about the government where I come from. She's like, she says, it's actually I'm really nervous right now to willingly identify myself with the government and say exactly how I feel. That's not something that in my home country I was able to do safely. So there's also a level of trust that has to get built over time. And we know, even for those of us in the room who were born here, I think especially right now, we have a lot of distrust in the government. But I think for a lot of folks coming from different countries and moving here to the U.S. and becoming legal permanent residents and then becoming citizens, it's a whole other conversation that's happening in their families and in their communities that I think is important to understand. So it's not as easy as just when a campaign says we're going to go target immigrant voters. It's well, one, they're not all the same. Immigrants come from a variety of places with a variety of experiences, backgrounds. So just also to say we're going to increase immigrant voter turnout. One, you have to respect the diversity of immigrant voices, and remember that. And something that we've been working on especially is the Washington Voting Rights Act. So that's something that a lot of our orgs have worked on together. It was a coalition of over 100 different, both legal nonprofits, community advocacy orgs, etc. And so OneAmerica led the coalition on that. And one of our, and in particular, to lift up our staffer, Samara, and Toby, and Rich, and Roxana. And so these are really key conversations that are happening about, we all know at-large elections, often privies people that have easier access to vote. And so when we have district elections, it allows for, hyper and stronger focus on voices of communities that often get overlooked. And what we also know is often immigrant communities live together. So district elections are really important in ensuring that immigrant voices are heard in city and county elections. And the majority of Washington State is at large. So take, for example, Yakima. Yakima is, at large, even though it has a massive immigrant population that is eligible to vote, much to what a lot of racists like to say, which is that somehow if you're an immigrant, somehow you're not a citizen, which is not true. So I think past that, after 7 years, so to say too, we know that working at state government, things tend to pass a little bit quicker pace, but that still took 7 years. And just this past year, the Native Voting Rights Act just passed a couple weeks ago, which is really exciting because here we have folks that we're on their, occupied land, and it's hard for them to vote. And so, to give you an example, and then I'll stop. But so we were, when I was out in Montana, and folks were talking about how the post office box gives a lot of tribal members one P.O. box for the entire family. And so it's larger intergenerational families. There's one key box with one key. And so folks often have to sometimes travel up to 60 miles to get to their P.O. box. So imagine if you had a mail-in ballot and you're having to drive 60 miles in November, to get to your ballot, it's very difficult, and you might very likely miss being able to turn your ballot in. And here in Washington State, there could be different, depending on which nations you're talking about in Washington State. But the Native Voting Rights Act is really critical, and I think when it got introduced, a lot of people, it was kind of like a light bulb of like, oh yeah, like, right, like, there are barriers also for our Native community. So I think that's also, just want to bring that in. And you can read more about it online. There's been some really great articles about it if you're interested in learning more about that.
Thank you, Eli. I love the way each of you are elucidating different aspects of how voting ends up being hard, because for some people it's just relatively easy. Like, we get our ballot in our mailbox, and because we do have the mail-in voting here, and many of us here probably have easy access to stamps, although I guess now we don't need a stamp anymore, right? Yeah, right, clap for that. I like supporting the U.S. Post Office. I'm just going to put that out there. But in any event, it's important for people to hear that so that we can think about, when we get later, to ways in which all of us can do some activism around this issue of voting rights. It's helpful to understand what the problems really are. So I want to come back to Breanne, and you alluded to something earlier about voter fraud and voter suppression, and there's definitely a really strong narrative happening right now about how, there's so much fraud, and like, basically there's one case of voter fraud in the past, in the past 1 million years. And so, okay, that was an exaggeration, but it's pretty close. I just want to say it's pretty close. And so what comes out of that is voter suppression. And voter suppression isn't new, but man, there's a resurgence in it. So Breanne, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about voter suppression and how that's showing up in general, but also, is it showing up in Washington State, and if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're absolutely seeing a resurgence and I think part of it is the mechanism which we suppress the vote, right? And part of it, I think, is because we have so many amazing organizations that are doing such great work to both get people out to vote and to change our laws and make it more accessible and equitable for people to vote. And that's wonderful. And so what happens sometimes is that then the government responds by making it harder in a different way, right? And so what we're seeing right now is kind of a resurgence a lot, especially in the issue of voter ID. So it isn't a new mechanism necessarily, like voting in the community in which it's intended to suppress their vote, right? But it is a different way in which jurisdictions are trying to go about and make it harder and more difficult for people to vote. So in Washington, thankfully, we don't require a photo ID in order to vote, which is really great. There are still a lot of ways in which we can improve, how you get your ballot and what you are required to show in order to vote. But thankfully, in this state, you don't have to have a photo ID to vote. But there are still a lot of mechanisms in which we both suppress the vote, as other people have kind of mentioned, and I'll just kind of go into two in a little bit more detail. And I think the first one is disenfranchisement for people that have felony convictions. So when we talk about, voter ID, I think a lot of people get it. There's been really good media coverage about how those laws are super racist. They're intentionally directed at creating barriers for people of color and making it harder for them to vote, right? But felony disenfranchisement or disenfranchisement for people with felony convictions comes from the exact same roots, right? So when, after the Civil War, we had a bunch of states in the South, and trickled obviously throughout the rest of the US, create laws specifically targeted, and at that time, because women couldn't vote, Black men, that would allow them to incarcerate and criminalize behavior that was specifically targeted at that population. And then what they did was they made laws that prohibited voting if you had those particular types of criminal convictions. In Washington State, what we've done is we actually put it in our Constitution. So you can't vote, you lose the right to vote if you have a felony conviction in Washington State. As Michelle kind of alluded to earlier, you do get it back. So we've made some progress, but there's still only 2 states in which you don't lose that right altogether, and that's Maine and Vermont. And so I think that remains, if you're incarcerated here in Washington, there's still a lot of work to be doing to make sure that people can vote, not just when they're released and still under DOC supervision, but that they can just vote, period, right? That you don't lose in the first place. The second thing, which Eli alluded to as well, is we still have a lot of systems that dilute the vote of communities of color. And how those show up in Washington, and it's actually pretty unique in some ways to this state, is that most of our jurisdictions have our at-large voting. And so what that means is everyone gets to vote for, all of your candidates for city council, for example. In Seattle, we're actually lucky, we have district-based voting, but many jurisdictions in Washington, and most jurisdictions don't. And so in cities like Yakima and Pasco and numerous other jurisdictions, where even there's a very significant portion of the population is Latinx, but because they're not the majority, they actually don't really get a voice in the government at all. So the white majority is making the rules for all of the constituents. And so I think those are two issues that play out nationally as well, but really play out specifically in Washington among all of the other methods of voter suppression that people, I'm sure, will continue to, everyone else has alluded to and discuss as well.
Thank you, Breanne. But as you know, of course, we have sued some of those jurisdictions, and successfully so. And of course, then also the Washington Voting Rights Act passed, which changed that. And we will absolutely get to questions after we get through a few of these here. You'll have an opportunity. There's a mic up here for that. When the time comes, I'll let you know. Excuse me. So another thing is just the democratic process, right? So part of it is voting, but part of it is just like some of you have already talked about it a little bit, how you can be more involved. So I wanted to turn to Xochitl to talk about that access issue and Washington Can's work, for example, with democracy vouchers. If you could talk a little bit about what that is and what that creates for people and why that was so important for you all to do.
So how many people are familiar with democracy vouchers? Good. How many people have them right now? Great, awesome. Don't lose them. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about what they are. So in 2015, we were part of a coalition. We all worked together quite a lot. So we were part of a coalition to push this concept around democracy vouchers, because how many people think the money involved in elections really destroys our democratic process? It does, okay. So we know that a lot of people either don't run for office because of how expensive it is. Like, you have to be able to raise a lot of money to even just get through the primary, right? And then you also, the people who can donate money tend to be the wealthy 62-year-old white folks, which is fine, but we also would like people like myself to be able to engage, right? So we pushed for the democracy vouchers via initiative in the city of Seattle. So what it does is it gives everyone who's a registered voter or a legal permanent resident or someone who's formerly incarcerated 4 $25 vouchers that you can give to a city council candidate so that they can fund their campaign, right? And the idea was that we are going to open up the door to people who can really connect with their community, but maybe don't have access to big, wealthy donors, so that they could potentially win an election. So it went into practice for the first time in 2017. And I'll give a little side note of a demonstration of why I think it's super important. So probably the big race in 2017 was City Council Position 8. It was an open seat. There were a lot of people running for office. The two candidates that got through the primary was one person who had a very deep connection to the community through a lot of the housing work that he had done, and then there was another person who also had a really deep connection to the community through a lot of the labor and healthcare work that she had done. They both got through the primary. Now, they both ended up maxing out their democracy vouchers. The other leading candidate, who I honestly at the time thought was going to get through the primary, was someone who's backed by the Chamber of Commerce. We're drinking her beer right now, but it's okay. She had a little bit more of a conservative bent, conservative as far as Seattle goes, and was backed by the Chamber of Commerce and a lot of business interests, and refused to use the democracy vouchers. She didn't get through the primary. And I think the other thing that happened around that time is whenever both of those candidates started raising a lot of money, some landlord groups sued the city saying that democracy vouchers were unconstitutional because you have all these non-property owning people who are now going to get vouchers, right? Meaning renters. Yeah. The thing I was really proud of is that Washington Can's tenant rights work was cited in their lawsuit as a reason why they were suing. Because they were essentially like, all of these non-property owning people are going to be electing these crazy tenant rights advocates onto city council. We did, so it was great. And so this was a way to really influence who's on city council, to make sure that the people who got onto city council were not just accountable to money, but they're accountable to real people, right? And it's really shaken up a lot of things. I can say specifically, because a lot of what we work on is around landlord-tenant issues, is it's really making the landlord groups nervous. And I think this year we're going to have another round where you're going to have 7 seats up. You're going to have the democracy vouchers again. It's going to make the business interest, I think, more nervous, because it hopefully will have a city council that's more accountable to the community rather than who happens to write some big checks.
Thank you. As you describe it, I just really feel the power of it, particularly as you describe where the backlash has come from, because it's about income inequality, right, at the end of the day, and like who has access. And if we're all supposed to be, equal under the law, but we're not, and we never have been, so then we have to think about equity under the law. And this is one of the ways that you bring equity into that process, so thank you for that. So Bridget, I know Washington Bus also worked on that, but I think there's other things you guys have also done to try to make the democratic process more accessible, and would love to hear about those.
Yes, the bus loves democracy vouchers so much. About democracy vouchers though, what's really amazing about them is that they provide an additional way for people to participate in an electoral process that isn't just voting. And if you're a green card holder, you can turn in democracy vouchers. So just want to elevate that. And the bus, we have historically worked to make our democratic process more accessible for specifically younger people. So last year, during session, we advocated, along with everybody here, for pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, which passed. Same-day voter registration, which also passed. And automatic voter registration, which also passed. And right now this year, we're really focusing on the implementation of these policies to make sure that our legislature implements them in a way that's effective, that works for everybody. And I really think that these policies are going to have a huge impact on youth voter turnout. Same-day voter registration, previously, people had to register to vote, people had to register to vote a month before Election Day. Which is a huge barrier for young folks and people who are working, who are going to school, who have a lot of things going on their plates. So not retired people, 62-year-olds, and bringing it back. And I think that with the same-day voter registration, we will see people being able to register to vote and vote on the day of the election. And Washington Bus is trying to work to have voting centers in King County at campuses, at UW, at other campuses, so that students can just register to vote and vote while they're on their way to class, which would be amazing. Also with pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, with that, which I think will be implemented in June, young students, high school students will be able to register when they're 16, 17, and then when they're 18, just automatically be registered, and they won't have to think about it. And that gives the Washington Bus and the school districts a lot of opportunity to talk to students about voter registration and voter engagement and civic engagement way earlier on in their high school career when they're sophomores and juniors. And then with automatic voter registration, right now you can opt out to register to vote instead of opt in, which makes a huge difference when you are getting an enhanced driver's license at the DOL. And then also when if you are using health exchange services. So it's kind of automatic, but it could be a lot more automatic. And the Washington Best really wants this process at this opt-out system to be implemented at other state agencies so that we could reach a broader range of people and more people that have historically been disenfranchised to make sure that they're registered to vote.
Fantastic, thank you. So Eli, I just thought I would ask you if there's any other bits of legislation or litigation or other types of advocacy that you would want to share with people, maybe that is flying under the radar that folks don't know about and you could draw attention to so the good folks here can be supportive?
Yes, definitely. I think, wow, there's a couple things. And I think there's also some nuance to it also. So I think one is it's easy. It's definitely like a quick thing to say, oh, let's have non-citizens be able to vote and run for office, et cetera. And we definitely want that. And in San Francisco, they actually did pass a law that allowed non-citizens to vote in school board elections. And what we found is that in this current political climate, people who are not citizens don't want to vote because it basically puts you on a register, basically. And so I think with a lot of those conversations, right, it comes down to like the deepest fight is, fighting against white supremacy, fighting against xenophobia, and ensuring that everyone in our community not only has the right to something, but actually has safety and access to that right. A right without access isn't a right at all. And so I think that's one thing. And then also making sure that as of right now, if you're a legal permanent resident, while you have more, a little bit more security and so forth, and it's easier to work, et cetera, you're still also not able to vote and or run for office. So I think another thing that's currently being discussed, which you'll probably hear more about soon, is trying to ensure that legal permanent residents can run for office as well, which is really important because a lot of folks are often legal permanent residents for decades. If anyone in the room has tried or attempted or successfully gone through the process of applying for citizenship, holy moly, it is so difficult and expensive and hard, and there are so many ways to get denied. Earlier convictions back when you're 20, if you're trying to become a citizen when you're 50, you can be denied. If you're, as of right now, the whole, I won't go into a whole rant on citizenship and how hard it is and how we need to have comprehensive immigration reform now, but there aren't lines to get into. So this idea of people who aren't citizens can just become citizens and then they can vote. That means people often live their entire lives in the United States or in our communities. These are our neighbors, these are our family, these are the parents of our of our kids' friends, and they're basically not being able to be full participants in our community, but yet they're also at the mercy of the of the law. So I just think that inequity is something that when we often get trapped in the ways that maybe, some of us were brought up. I know growing up in Texas, there's so many just racist ideas or tropes around why people should have a right to something and why they shouldn't. And I think at the end of the day, if we find ourselves reading a newspaper article and be like, oh wow, that's radical, well, pause. Why? Why is someone having the dignity of expressing and sharing their needs and their values and how they want to shape their community? How is that radical? This is a nonviolent act. This is democracy. So I think it's interesting that sometimes, you often hear radical new idea, and et cetera. It's well, no, dignity isn't radical, and and if it become, that it's so depressing to me that it's become that. And so I think voting and voting rights is really around people's dignity. And that's something that we should be fighting tooth and nail for. And then lastly, around something everyone can advocate for is revenue and a fair tax system in our state. We have the most upside down tax code in the nation. Literally, we're dead last. We have the worst tax code. So the lowest income earners are in the highest, are taxed the highest ratio of their income. The highest earners are taxed the least. And why does that impact voting? Well, our county auditors and our voting systems rely on taxes. So if we want more accessible ballots in other languages, guess what? That costs money. You know, if we want to ensure that our school districts are able to properly and effectively register students and pre-register students, that costs money, you know? So, you know, capitalism costs money, and so, surprise. And so I think that sometimes we don't tend to put those issues together, but I think revenue and progressive revenue is key to everything we're talking about, and when we think about implementation and we think about being effective and access.
Thank you for that. Awesome. Yeah, let's all agree that dignity is not radical. That's just what we all deserve. So what I'll just do, because I know there are some questions that you all have, is I'm just going to kind of start with Breanne and work our way back down to me. Any other thing that each of you would like to share about the work you're doing, or about a way in which folks here can be involved? Now is your chance to share that. So Breanne, take it away.
Sure. So I guess I'll kind of just not end officially, but end before questions, and with just thanking everyone on this panel for all of the incredible work that each and every one of you and your organizations have done to make this right meaningful and like dismantle barriers to accessing the right to vote and making it accessible and sharing information. And I think and right now I feel like a lot of us feel super kind of helpless and hopeless, and the work that you all have done is really invigorating and like reminds me about how we have actually made a lot of progress, and we are going to continue to make a lot of progress, and we're going to continue to fight this tooth and nail. And so I hope that everyone feels just as inspired as I do to get involved with each of these organizations.
So one thing I'll mention is I think the local and state elections are so important. Like, I understand that everyone thinks about the presidential election, but honestly, that's probably the thing I think about last, right? And part of the reason is so for example, when you look at Olympia, so many legislators are landlords. When you start looking at their financials, or when you start like talking to them one-on-one, because some of them don't report it, you start learning, everyone in Olympia thinks that tenant rights is controversial because all of y'all are landlords and you've never really talked to renters. And like the fact that we have, and I know there's a whole lot of other issues that are similar to this, I'm just very immersed in housing right now, is that when you look at the laws right now, it's as if the landlord industry just wrote the whole thing and was like, that's what it'll be. Because we have a system where if you're late on your rent, you get 3 days grace period, and then you're just screwed. It doesn't matter how behind you were, it doesn't matter why. You could be in the hospital, it doesn't matter, right? You're just evicted, you're out. And we have a system that's so unforgiving because you have people who are elected who have financial interest in keeping the system unforgiving. And it's the same way on the local level. And so I would just encourage folks to just think about like pushing for these basic rights around housing, immigration, and other things, like with your local officials, making it clear to them, especially because, I mean, how many people in this room are homeowners? Okay, so I'm gonna assume that you guys really do care about people who are renters and people who don't have access to owning homes. I think legislators hearing from you that you care about, hey, I want strong tenant rights, I want resources for people who are experiencing homelessness. That really does go a long way, because it's really gonna break this very strange narrative that I don't quite understand in Olympia around around what issues should pass and why, and really push legislators to be bold, because I personally don't think that any elected officials ever really want to be bold. It just, I look at my job as like pushing them into a corner and giving them no options. So I ask that you join me in that effort and help. Let's push them into corners and give them no options. So in order to make sure that people have dignity.
So with OneAmerica, we have a lot of different volunteer opportunities. We do free citizenship clinics across the state. If you want to come and help and see and learn exactly how difficult it is to apply for citizenship, and a lot of orgs that we work with and a lot of attorneys provide free services. So if you're an attorney in the room and you want to get involved, we work with a lot of folks on that process. We also do a lot of door knocking, phone banking, etc. So I think volunteering and being not just a voter, but also recruiting your friends to come and door knock on endorsed candidate. I mean, we're biased, so we want you to do it for the candidates that our organizations endorse. But I think that's important. I know from OneAmerica, because we have a whole cycle where we organize in immigrant communities. We support them with citizenship. We also work with folks to be engaged with getting out the vote. We have our leaders do the endorsements. So in a lot of orgs, we have like a special committee that does it kind of hiding away in a room. So our actual leaders and people that we work with in our communities do our endorsements. So if someone's endorsed by OneAmerica, they're endorsed by immigrant leaders, not just immigrant policy experts. And so I think that's really important. And also just knowing that civic engagement is a cycle. It's not just civic touch points. And so thinking for all of us about our civic lives and how we engage, and I think too, just redefining what we think of as radical civic engagement, and just kind of touching back that, dignity isn't a radical thing, that it's something that should be very inherent. And then just lastly, just want to lift up that also when we think about access, that we're also making sure, and we're thinking about our communities and public safety, that we don't forget the diversity of immigrant communities. We tend to lump them all together. The media lumps everyone together, and that there's so much diversity within that, and it's not quite as simple as just saying like the immigrant vote, et cetera. And so that's just something that we talk about a lot at OneAmerica, and just encourage us all to kind of think about as well.
So I saw a lot of homeowners. If any of you are landlords, provide voter registration forms to any of your new tenants, especially if they're students. I know when I was in college, I moved like 6 times, which is like pretty average for students, and I did not update my voter registration every time. And I've been advocating for voting justice for a long time, so that's bad.
I'll just say, if you are a landlord, you have to do that in Seattle, so make sure you are doing it.
But yeah, there's definitely a lot of different ways you can show up for the bus. Right now we're at college campuses before they're out for the summer. Old Spring Quarter, we're at Green River, Highline, UW Bothell, Bellevue, Seattle U, a lot of other, Seattle Central, North Seattle, a lot of other colleges, and we're there registering students to vote. So if you want to come out and register students to vote with us, I would love that. And then also in the fall, we need a lot of help with our GOTV work. We'll be like phone banking multiple times a week. We'll be door knocking every weekend. We're also text banking, which is a cool new thing, and reminding young people to vote and really helping them develop a plan for how they're going to turn in their ballot, where their ballot drop boxes, like where we used to be like, where do you get a stamp? Because a lot of young people like never buy stamps. But yeah, so there's a lot of different ways for you to volunteer with us. Also, if any of you have high schoolers in your life and they want to host a voter registration drive at their high school, we would love to connect and help you make that happen for them. I think it's really impactful when peers are asking their other peers to register to vote, and it makes a huge difference on how many of those high school students are like actually going to register to vote. And then lastly, we have a really cool event every summer called Bus Bash. And we would love if you'll came and learn more about the Washington Bus, the work that we do, and meet a lot of our really young, rad youth organizers who are just trying to make impactful changes in their community. And if you want more information on like how to get involved with that, you can visit our social media accounts. But yes, thank you.
Awesome. So all of these organizations have a website. I don't know, some of you might have brought materials out that are out on the table too, so please check it out and learn more about it. And then here with the ACLU of Washington, you can be signed up for action alerts. So we're a nonpartisan organization. We don't have a political identity in terms of a party representation, but we do want you to be engaged and we want you to be active. And when there are issues happening in the legislature that impact our civil rights and our civil liberties, we will ask you and invite you to join with us in supporting those things and nudging the legislators and moving them in the direction of that. And I know we've had action alerts recently about data privacy and about reproductive rights, and these are all bills that are happening in the legislature. So if you're not already doing that, please do that and give us an opportunity to, maybe once or twice a week, get in your email inbox and let you know a way that you can be directly civically active and engaged on issues that matter to democracy. So that being said, I know there are some questions. So we have a microphone over here, which we would love for you to come to. And as folks line up for that, some of you kind of know this drill, but there will be a few people lined up. So what I'll probably do is just gather up a few questions first, and then